Okay, so this video is going to focus on state aid programs, so just those that are administered through the California Student Aid Commission. I don't mention, but I will mention it here, the fifth year Cal Grant. Just think of that as like a special extension of the Cal Grant program for students who are pursuing a teaching credential within 15 months of their last receipt of a Cal Grant. So they have to get on it pretty quick. So let's begin with some history. California Student Aid Commission. They're the agency that's responsible for administering all of our Cal Grant, middle class, JP, that kind of thing. They were formerly known as the California State Scholarship Commission, and their sole responsibility in 1955 was to oversee the California State Scholarship Program for academically qualified students who were low to middle income and attending private universities. That's all they did for the first 5 years. But in 1960, the California Master Plan for Education came into play. You might hear about the master plan in other videos or from other folks. It's a huge driving force behind the trajectory that California has been on and our history and how our educational system has gone in terms of higher education. But in 1960, that definitely called for a change to expand access to college for students who weren't attending private universities, but who were attending public sector as well. So there was, again, the legislature was on this tuition free, right? Kind of like what the national debate is right now to make tuition free. Well, California was having those debates in the 60s, and so they expanded the California Scholarship Program to include and to really look at tuition at not just privates, but also public universities. But if you think about it, in the 60s, tuition was pretty low, right? So that, and there weren't a ton of students attending college. We were getting there, but we were not quite at our peak of college enrollment, right? And so if you think about it, low cost, low enrollment numbers equals what? Low utilization of the program. So we could afford it at the time. But over the next 30 years, not only did we increase exponentially in terms of college enrollment and college-going culture, but in 1990 we saw a huge spike in college costs. And so what happens when you have more enrollment and higher costs? Well, you have more utilization of the program. And at this point, I believe it had transitioned into the Cal Grant program. But there was no guarantee that a student was going to get a Cal Grant just because they met the criteria. So students could apply, but they weren't necessarily guaranteed this funding. 10 years later, Governor Gray Davis was a big proponent of more aid that focused on merit and not just on financial need. So he introduced the Merit Scholars Program, which is still in existence today. The legislature at the time, though, was a little bit dismayed because they were super proud of the state aid program that we had built. It was very strong. It was creating the accessibility on which it was founded, right, its core principle. So they responded, though, to this push for merit by expanding the Cal Grant further. And what they did was they created higher income ceilings, right? Students at higher income levels tend to have higher GPAs. And I believe at that time is where they also increased the GPA, from what I recall, to the 3.0. In 2008, we had the economic crash, right? And that definitely had to trickle down to the states nationally. And in 2011, our then governor, or now former Governor Jerry Brown, signed into law that students were no longer going to automatically qualify for renewal if they filled out the FAFSA application for Cal Grant, okay? So prior to this, students only had to qualify once to be eligible for the program for multiple years, either up to 4 years if they came in as a freshman, or up to 2 years if they, it was a 4-year program, so never mind. If they come in as a transfer to our institution, it would have been 2 years. But they might have qualified as 4 years, 2 years at the community college, 2 years at the UC. So before that, they only had to meet those ceilings once, right? And they were never checked again. They just had to apply for the FAFSA each year. Well, after 2011, now students had to pass annually, both the income and asset ceilings. You only had to pass the GPA once, but you now have to pass the income and assets every year. And that, as per usual, right, had to do with budget. So I pulled out this image from, it's called the Century Foundation. They did a study on all the state aid programs that CSAC administers. And I attached their appendix to our classroom for your review. I would highly encourage that you review it. But I pulled out this image because they did a nice little timeline of when things changed, right? When legislation changed that authorized Cal Grant programs. So you'll see over here, State Scholarship Program. We then had the Subsistence Act, then kept transitioning. In 2000, though, is when we had the big overhaul. So we continued the Cal Grant A and Cal Grant B programs from those earlier 1955, 1967 legislation. So remember, not everyone was guaranteed a Cal Grant. But in 2000, we created the entitlement programs. And that's where Cal Grant became a guarantee, right? If you got into the entitlement program, typically you were graduating from high school. If you met the criteria, you were guaranteed that assistance. And then the DREAM Act was born in 2011, as you'll see by AB 130 and 131. So it's a nice overview of the timeline, and it is also in that appendix. So let's back up and again talk about the commission. Okay, what is the commission? Well, the commission's kind of like an advisory board. Okay, their responsibility is to bring in their varied expertise on education and financial aid and policy and that kind of thing, and make sure that the commission is responsibly handling the billions and billions of dollars that they administer. So it's the membership, or the commission, is comprised of 15 members, 11 who are appointed by the governor, although those appointees have to be approved by the state senate. 2 of them are student members who serve 2-year terms, and the rest serve 4-year terms. So again, think of them as kind of like an advisory board. I will say, though, that CSAC, the executive staff side of the commission, the executive director is both part of the commission board and also part of the executive staff. So that staff consults with the financial aid advisory board. Now that board comes and goes. It depends on the commissioner or the executive officer of the commission, but currently that board is in place, and it's comprised of over a dozen different financial aid advising staff, like leaders, who have expert knowledge on financial aid policy and who come from financial aid offices and the systems. And they come and are kind of consultants to the staff on any kind of changes they want to make and how it might impact financial aid. So what is the mission of CSAC? Well, as I mentioned, they provide financial aid policy analysis and leadership and partnering with all of our segments across California, as well as financial aid associations, kind of like CASFA, for example, California Association for Student Financial Aid Administrators. They partner with all these entities for one mission, and that's to make post-secondary education accessible to all California students. So here are their current programs. As I mentioned, the Century Foundation did a study on all the current programs that they administer, and the results of that report were fed up through the executive director. That person consulted, the former executive director consulted with the legislature, and now we have this thing that's moving its way through the state legislature called the Cal Grant Reform Act. So kind of like you saw that timeline and all the Cal Grant legislation, we have something anew that's coming into the fold. It's in its infancy, so I'm not sure what's going to happen with it. But as of this recording, I just wanted to note that it's making its way through the legislature, and the intent is to simplify all of the programs to make it easier for families to understand. And of course, whenever you make something easy on the front end, it tends to make other things more complicated, right? So we'll see where that lands. The California Chafee Grant Program is pretty interesting. That was actually born out of an amendment to the Foster Care Independence Act. The Foster Care Independence Act was actually, I believe, sponsored by Senator Chafee at the federal level. He passed away before it was able to pass, and it was passed. But the amendment, the HR, came later, and we dubbed that the California Chafee Grant in his honor, right? Chafee Grant Program. He was a huge proponent of aid and assistance to former foster youth in order to transition them to adulthood, so that they too could make their way and into being self-sufficient. And so the resolution that passed opened up some of that funding from the original law to be focused on students transitioning to college. And so because our state already had an entity that focused on financial aid for college, the legislature, and I'm sure the governor at the time, said, okay, well, you're going to administer this Chafee Grant Fund. And what it requires is matching dollars from the state. So part of this is federal money coming from things like TANF or other federal programs, as well as state matching funds. CSAC also administers the Middle Class Scholarship, intended to meet the needs of middle class families. because they were getting squeezed, right? That came into effect, I believe it was 2012, and it was full-fledged in 2014. The idea behind it to help some of these middle-income families who have too much to get a lot of need-based aid, but have too little to just be full payers. That also has income and asset ceilings. The National Guard was intended to promote National Guard participation in higher education. Unfortunately, the lack of participation, it's probably not going to get renewed as a program in terms of funding from the state, and so that program is likely to sunset July 1st of 2019. This law enforcement personnel dependence grant program was for students whose parents had passed away in the line of duty. Unfortunately, it was super popular its first year, which is about 5 years ago, and it hasn't received funding since 2016-17, so it doesn't look like that program is going to continue. I did just want to call out that, in the history, what began as a program intended for students who were only attending private universities, well, now Cal Grant in particular has flipped on its head, because now Cal Grant amounts, right, are tied to tuition except at the private universities. There was some changes a few years back where the funding was slashed for students who were attending private universities, and that's because their tuition is significantly higher than the public sector's, typically, more than double. So their Cal Grant, though, is lower than our Cal Grant in the public sectors, right? So I believe at last check, it's around $9,000 for tuition for Cal Grant for a student who wants to go to a private school versus, right, at UC, our tuition 12, 13, 14, it just keeps climbing, and it keeps matching it typically each year. So just kind of an interesting note that what began as just geared towards privates has now kind of flipped around. So I did also want to call out that CSAC is also responsible for conducting a SEER survey, which is like their version of a cost of attendance survey. Now, UC doesn't use this because we conduct our own cost of attendance surveys, but I did want to note that this exists. I do know that CSUs tend to use this budget. So before, CSAC used to put in the food and housing, but because there's been some pushback on that, since there's 23 CSU campuses across the state, and they're all in very diverse economic areas, that they just rely on the institutional charges. So kind of interesting. Here's just a look at that appendix that will be attached to the classroom. I highly encourage you to read through this summary and history of all the California financial aid programs. They've done an excellent job of reviewing each of the Cal Grant portions, telling you how they were legislated, their purpose, their intent, any other special eligibility criteria, and so on and so forth. So it's a very good resource. I did want to say exercise caution if you direct students to csac.ca.gov. It's built as a student-facing portal, which is great. They can check on their Cal Grant eligibility. But when you get into the financial aid programs, which you access for students' financial aid programs, when you click on Cal Grants, for example, things like this. Oh, you just have to be a California resident for a year. Well, that's not technically true, right? Because in order to be considered for Cal Grant, they rely on the institutions to determine residency. So as we know, the University of California, as of this recording in April 8th, 2019, has a fairly strict residence requirement. So an out-of-state student who comes to California and lives here for a year would not be eligible for Cal Grant. They have to, even so, they have to attend a California high school. But let's say they attended a California high school, moved out of the state for 2 years. If they came back and they're starting to go to college, at UC, they have to establish 2 years of financial independence, right? Which is nearly impossible if they're a dependent student, or be dependent upon a California resident. So, sometimes I get students who kind of push back, well, this says on the Cal Grant website. So just, again, use caution. We know the rules, and Cal Grant, or CSAC, has done a great job of improving this website, but sometimes I catch things that might differ from what we know as financial aid officers. Here's just a visual of the members of the commission as appointed by the governor, and their bios are below. And you'll see that they come from kind of varied backgrounds. This person works for the strong higher education for a strong economy, which is like a nonprofit. She works at the Notre Dame University. This one came from a unified school district. Like, they're kind of from every wide variety of backgrounds, so you can take a look at their bios there. In addition to the aid programs, CSAC is also responsible for outreach, and they do that through these kinds of programs. So their biggest is the CalSOAP program, which is the California Student Opportunity and Access Program, and they partner with financial aid officers to put on, either in the classroom or on campuses, information workshops about financial aid and raising with the intent of raising kind of aspirations and achievements for low-income students. They also put on this Every Kid Counts. It's a grant program for cities, counties, nonprofits to apply to in order to encourage college savings programs for students who are young, right? And encourage that kind of college-going culture. They also put on Cash for College, which is strictly about filling out the FAFSA or DREAM app. We do some of these occasionally. And this year they also put on a bilingual conference, the first of its kind from what I recall in Northern California in Sacramento. So Davis participated, CSUs, and UC in general. Just kind of a wraparound type conference about the steps to getting into college and going to college. So I thought those were interesting. Another thing I want to call out about their site is they do, as a public entity, they are required to put out these reports. And so if we look at the Cal Grant one, here's one that are Cal Grants offered and paid by dollars by state Senate districts, right? And they report by Senate. It makes sense. They are administered or overseen by the state legislature. And that's something that the legislature would want to know. But as you'll see, the bottom line, right? 370,000 awards, a little over that, at $2.1 billion, okay? And that's just the Cal Grant program, but that's by far and away our largest state or largest financial aid program in the state. So you'll see it's pretty critical and important, and it's very, especially at UC, very coveted because it covers quite a bit. And we're very fortunate to have it, which why when there's legislation where they're talking about this Cal Grant reform, we get a little nervous sometimes, because right now our students are receiving a substantial benefit, and it's helping us create this greater level of access, not just for Cal Grant recipients, right? That it has a trickle-down effect. It's also creating access for other students that we're able to fund from our own university dollars, who we may otherwise be unable to support because of our limited USAP, right? So again, just very interesting. I highly encourage, again, to review the Century Foundation Appendix.